Social engineering, the art of human hacking. Setting the stage. Let us begin with an uncomfortable fact. You can spend your entire security budget on the best firewall money can buy, the most advanced endpoint detection platform on the market, and a SIM that correlates every log source you own, and none of it matters if someone in accounts payable believes a well-crafted email from the CEO. Ask a room full of engineers what the biggest threat to their organization is, and most of them will describe a technical scenario: an unpatched server, a misconfigured S3 bucket, a zero-day in a widely used library. Ask someone who has actually run incident response for a decade, and they will tell you something quieter and more unsettling. The biggest threat is not a piece of code, it is a phone call, it is a badge left unchecked at a door. It is a help desk technician who wants, more than anything else, to be helpful to the person on the other end of the line who sounds stressed and in a hurry. That is social engineering, the psychological manipulation of people into performing actions or divulging information they would never hand over if they had a moment to think clearly. It does not exploit a vulnerability in your code, it exploits a vulnerability in your species. Trust, fear, urgency, and the desire to be helpful are not bugs in human psychology, they are features. They are what make teams function, what make customer service possible, what make organizations livable places to work. Social engineering does not attack a flaw, it attacks a strength and turns it against you. This session is about understanding that inversion completely. From the psychological mechanics that make it work, to the technical and administrative controls that blunt it, to what happens when those controls fail and someone has to figure out why, and finally to what it looks like when an organization gets the response exactly right under real pressure with real money on the line. The foundation, what social engineering actually is. Let us start with a definition precise enough to survive an interview room. Social engineering is the use of psychological influence to cause a person to take an action or reveal information that benefits the attacker and works against the interests of the person or their organization. It is, in the most literal sense, hacking the human operating system instead of the machine one. There are three archetypal forms you need to know cold, because they will appear in almost every conversation about this topic, and every version of them shows up somewhere in the wild constantly. The first is phishing. This is the mass market version of social engineering, delivered by email, and it works on volume. An attacker sends thousands of messages designed to look like they come from a bank, a shipping company, or an internal system, hoping that even a small percentage of recipients will click a malicious link or enter credentials into a fake login page. Phishing is not sophisticated by design. It does not need to be. If you send 10,000 emails and only 2% of people click, that is 200 compromised accounts from a single afternoon of effort. The second is vishing, voice phishing, where the manipulation happens over a phone call rather than through text. Vishing is more resource-intensive per target than email phishing because it requires a live human or increasingly an AI-generated voice to hold a real-time conversation and adapt to what the victim says. But it is also far more effective per attempt because voice carries emotional cues that text cannot. A frightened, urgent tone of voice does something to a listener that an email cannot replicate. This is precisely why vishing is the weapon of choice against help desks, where a stressed-sounding employee claiming they are locked out of their account during a critical deadline can talk a well-meaning technician into resetting a privileged password without following proper identity verification. The third is tailgating, sometimes called piggybacking, which moves social engineering into the physical world entirely. This is the act of following an authorized person through a secured door without presenting your own credentials, relying on politeness and the awkwardness of confrontation to get you inside. Someone in a delivery uniform carrying two large boxes approaches a badge-secured door just as an employee is walking through it. The employee holds the door. Nobody wants to be the person who makes a stranger struggle with boxes while a badge scanner beeps at them. That single-held door defeats every dollar spent on access control systems. Beyond these three, you should be fluent in a handful of adjacent techniques, because interviewers love probing whether you understand the full taxonomy rather than just the headline terms. Pretexting is the construction of a fabricated scenario, a pretext used to engage a victim and extract information. The attacker posing as an IT auditor conducting a routine security review is a pretext. Baiting is the use of a tempting object, physical or digital, such as a USB drive left in a parking lot labeled Executive Salaries 2024, to lure a victim into compromising their own system out of curiosity. Quid pro quo is a variant where the attacker offers something of perceived value, commonly posing as technical support offering to fix a problem the victim didn't know they had, in exchange for credentials or access. And whaling is simply phishing aimed specifically at senior executives, where the payoff for success is disproportionately large because executives hold disproportionate authority and access. Now, here is the question that actually matters, the one that separates someone who has memorized definitions from someone who understands the discipline. Why is the human considered the weakest link in the security chain, and is that framing even fair? The honest answer is nuanced. Humans are not weak because they are stupid. They are exploitable because they are trusting, cooperative, and driven by social norms that exist for excellent reasons in every other context of their lives. Holding a door for someone is polite. Helping a colleague who says they're locked out is good teamwork. Responding quickly to an urgent request from a superior is professionalism. Social engineering does not defeat these instincts through some clever technical trick. It weaponizes them directly. This is why security awareness training that simply tells people don't trust anyone fails. It asks people to abandon the social contract that makes organizations functional, and most people, quite reasonably, will not do that permanently. The real goal of a mature security awareness program is not to make people paranoid. It is to give them a small number of specific, low-friction verification habits that they can apply without becoming suspicious of every human interaction they have. The structural tension, helpfulness versus verification. Every mental model worth teaching contains a genuine tension, a conflict between two things that both matter and cannot simply be resolved by picking one and discarding the other. For social engineering, that tension sits between organizational helpfulness and procedural verification. An organization that trains its employees to verify everything, to question every request, to demand proof of identity before taking any action, will be more resistant to social engineering. It will also be a miserable, slow, bureaucratic place to work, and eventually people will find workarounds to the friction, which reintroduces the very risk the friction was meant to prevent. This is not a hypothetical. It is the exact mechanism by which Shadow It is born. When official processes are too slow or too rigid, employees root around them using personal cloud storage, unofficial messaging apps, or informal favors, and every one of those workarounds is a new, unmonitored surface that a social engineer can exploit. Conversely, an organization that optimizes purely for speed and helpfulness, where the highest praise a help desk technician can receive is resolved in under 2 minutes, will be fast and pleasant to interact with, and it will also be catastrophically vulnerable to anyone who sounds sufficiently urgent and sufficiently authoritative on the phone. The MGM Resorts breach in 2023, widely reported in the security press, is the textbook case study here. Attackers reportedly spent about 10 minutes on a phone call with the IT help desk, impersonating an employee, and walked away with credentials that led to a shutdown of casino floor systems and hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. The help desk did exactly what it was trained to do: help quickly. That was the entire vulnerability. The resolution to this tension is not a technology purchase. It is a design principle: build verification into the workflow in a way that costs the legitimate user almost nothing, while costing the attacker something they structurally cannot produce. A callback to a phone number on file, rather than the phone number the caller provides, costs a legitimate employee about 90 seconds and costs an attacker the one thing they don't have: control of the real employee's actual phone. A known answer security question that isn't guessable from a LinkedIn profile costs nothing to the legitimate user and is nearly impossible for an attacker who has only researched the target from public sources. This is the pattern behind almost every good social engineering defense you'll examine in this session. Shift the cost of verification onto the axis where the attacker is structurally weak, rather than the axis where the legitimate user is structurally busy. The architectural philosophy, defense in depth applied to humans. If zero trust is what happens when you take the trade-off model to its logical extreme in a network architecture, defense in depth applied to social engineering is what happens when you accept that no single control, technical or human, will ever be sufficient on its own. The architecture that actually works layers three categories of control, and understanding why each layer exists and what it cannot do alone is the difference between a checklist and real comprehension. The first layer is technical. This is the email gateway that authenticates sender domains, the multi-factor authentication that means a stolen password alone is worthless, the endpoint protection that catches the payload if someone does click. Technical controls are fast, consistent, and do not get tired or distracted at 4 in the afternoon, but they are also fundamentally reactive to known patterns. A sufficiently novel pretext, one that doesn't trip any technical signature, sails straight through because the technology has nothing to pattern match against. The second layer is administrative. This is the policy that says wire transfers above a certain threshold require a callback verification. The procedure that says password resets for privileged accounts require identity confirmation through a secondary channel. The separation of duties rule that means no single person, however convincing the request they receive, can authorize a large financial transaction alone. Administrative controls are where organizational judgment gets encoded into a repeatable process. Their weakness is that they only work if they are actually followed under pressure, and pressure is precisely the tool the social engineer is using to try to make someone skip the step. The third layer is human. This is the individual employee's trained instinct to recognize urgency, authority, and unusual requests as signals worth pausing on. Human vigilance is the most adaptable layer, capable of recognizing entirely novel pretexts that no technical signature or written policy anticipated. It is also the least reliable layer because human attention fluctuates, because a sufficiently well-researched pretext can feel completely legitimate, and because the entire discipline of social engineering exists specifically to defeat human judgment under the exact conditions, time pressure, authority pressure, emotional pressure, where that judgment is weakest. None of these three layers is sufficient alone. Technical controls without administrative process leave you exposed the moment an attacker crafts something novel enough to bypass the filter. Administrative process without human buy-in becomes a policy nobody actually follows once it's inconvenient. Human vigilance without technical and administrative backup means your entire security posture rests on every single employee, every single time making the right call under pressure, and eventually, statistically, someone won't. The architecture that works is the one where each layer covers the blind spot of the other two. Tools and the trade-offs they carry. Every tool deployed against social engineering is, like every security tool, a materialized trade-off. Understanding a tool means understanding what it costs and what it structurally cannot see, not just what it advertises on its product page. Consider the phishing simulator. What it gives you is measurable, repeatable exposure to realistic attack patterns in a consequence-free environment, letting an organization see exactly what percentage of its workforce would click a malicious link, and more importantly, letting individuals experience the oh no moment of nearly falling for something without any actual damage occurring. What it costs is trust if deployed carelessly. A simulated phishing email that is too aggressive, that impersonates something like a layoff announcement or a family emergency to maximize the click rate, generates genuine anger and erodes goodwill toward the security team, sometimes for years. What it cannot do is fully replicate the emotional stakes of a real attack. Employees who intellectually know, even subconsciously, that security runs these tests periodically bring a slightly different level of scrutiny to a suspicious email than they would if the stakes were unambiguously real. The simulator measures susceptibility to the mechanics of phishing. It cannot perfectly measure susceptibility under genuine duress. Consider FIDO2 hardware key multi-factor authentication, one of the strongest available defenses against credential harvesting. What it gives you is remarkable. Even if an attacker successfully social engineers a user into typing their password into a perfect replica of a login page, the attacker still cannot authenticate because the hardware key performs a cryptographic challenge bound to the legitimate domain that a phishing site cannot replicate. This is the single most effective technical countermeasure to credential-based phishing that currently exists at scale. What it costs is logistics. Every employee needs a physical key, lost keys need rapid revocation and reissuance, and any workflow requiring authentication from a device without a USB or NFC port needs an alternative path, which itself becomes a potential downgrade attack surface if not carefully designed. What it cannot do is stop every category of social engineering. FIDO2 defeats credential phishing beautifully. It does nothing to stop a phishing call that convinces a help desk technician to reset an MFA enrollment entirely, because the attack in that scenario never touches the authentication mechanism at all. It targets the process that manages the authentication mechanism. Consider DMARC, the email authentication standard that lets a domain owner publish a policy instructing receiving mail servers how to handle messages that fail sender verification. What it gives you is a powerful defense against domain spoofing. An attacker cannot send email that appears to come directly from CEO at your company, com, if DMARC is properly configured with a reject policy. What it costs is implementation complexity and the very real risk of breaking legitimate mail flow if configured incorrectly. Organizations that rush to a strict DMARC policy without first auditing every legitimate system that sends mail on their behalf, marketing platforms, HR systems, ticketing tools, can find themselves accidentally blocking their own newsletters or automated notifications. What it cannot do, and this is the detail that trips people up in interviews, is stop lookalike domain attacks. An attacker doesn't need to spoof your company, com, if they can simply register your company support, com, or more insidiously, a domain using a 0 in place of an O or a lowercase l in place of a capital I. DMARC has nothing to say about a domain that isn't yours but merely resembles it. Consider the visitor management system, the physical world control against tailgating and unauthorized site access. What it gives you is an auditable, scanned record of every person entering a facility, tied to a specific badge, a specific host, and a specific time window. What it costs is friction at every entry point and an ongoing administrative burden of managing visitor lists, expiring temporary badges, and training reception staff to actually enforce the policy rather than waving through anyone who looks like they belong. What it cannot do is stop the tailgating scenario described earlier, where a legitimate badge-holding employee simply holds the door for a stranger out of politeness. A visitor management system controls the front desk. It has no jurisdiction over social norms at a side door. None of these four tools are wrong to deploy. Every organization serious about this threat should deploy all four. The point of examining them this way is to internalize that none of them, individually or even collectively, closes every gap. That is precisely why the layered architecture discussed earlier is not optional decoration. It is the only honest response to a threat that adapts specifically to root around whatever single control you deployed most recently. Implementation, where theory meets a real training program. Let us move from the conceptual to the concrete. Suppose you are asked to design and implement a phishing simulation and security awareness training program for an organization of a few thousand employees that has never run one before. What does that actually involve, beyond send some fake emails and see who clicks? The first decision is cadence and escalation. A single annual phishing test, the kind many organizations run purely to check a compliance box, produces almost no lasting behavioral change because a once-a-year exposure doesn't build a durable habit. A monthly cadence with difficulty that increases gradually, starting with obviously suspicious emails containing spelling errors and unfamiliar senders, and progressing over months toward highly targeted, well-researched pretexts that mirror actual internal communication style, builds pattern recognition the way any skill is built, through spaced repetition under realistic conditions. The second decision, and the one organizations get wrong most often, is what happens to someone who clicks. The instinct in a compliance-driven culture is punitive. Track click rates per employee, report them to management, treat repeated failures as a disciplinary matter. This is close to the worst possible design because it teaches employees to hide mistakes rather than report them, and the entire value of a security-aware workforce collapses the moment people are afraid to say, "I think I clicked something bad," out of fear of being written up. The correct design treats a click as a teaching moment delivered immediately and specifically. The employee is redirected instantly to a short page explaining exactly which signals in that email indicated it was a phishing attempt, the mismatched sender domain, the urgency language, the generic greeting, so the lesson lands while the context is still fresh in their mind. Aggregate, anonymized metrics go to leadership to demonstrate organizational trend and program value. Individual results stay largely coaching-oriented rather than punitive, except in cases of genuine, repeated, willful disregard after multiple rounds of targeted support. The third decision is what a colleague pushing back on your design would immediately ask. How do you handle the employee who fails the same type of simulation 4 times in a row? This is where the graduated response plan becomes necessary, and it needs to be built before the program launches, not improvised after the fact. A reasonable structure escalates gradually. The first failure triggers the automated just-in-time training already described. A second failure within a defined window triggers a short mandatory one-on-one session with the security awareness team, not as punishment but as diagnosis. Sometimes the issue is genuine lack of understanding, and sometimes it reveals that the employee's role involves a workflow that makes them structurally more exposed, such as an accounts payable clerk who receives dozens of legitimate invoice emails daily and has been trained by volume to click quickly. A third failure warrants closer monitoring of that account's activity and a conversation with their manager about role-specific risk. Only sustained, willful disregard after genuine support has been offered should ever escalate toward access restriction or disciplinary process, and that threshold should be documented and consistent, not applied arbitrarily. The fourth consideration, often skipped, is measuring the right thing. Click rate alone is a shallow metric because it can be gamed by making simulations progressively easier, and it doesn't capture the behavior that actually matters most: reporting. A mature program tracks the ratio of employees who report a suspicious email to the security team, whether or not they clicked it, because an organization full of people who click but also immediately report gives the SOC a live early warning signal, while an organization full of people who never click but also never report anything unusual has simply trained its workforce to quietly delete threats instead of surfacing them for analysis. The report rate, not the click rate, is often the truer signal of a healthy security culture. The troubleshooting lens, when the human layer fails. Understanding the defense in theory is one skill. Diagnosing why it failed in a specific real incident is a different, more demanding skill, and it is the one interviewers probe hardest because it reveals whether you actually think like a practitioner or just recite frameworks. The first scenario, a phishing attack tricks the help desk into resetting a privileged account's password. The attacker claimed to be a senior director locked out ahead of an urgent board presentation, sounded appropriately stressed, and knew enough real details: the director's actual name, their actual department, the fact that a board meeting genuinely was happening that week, to sound credible. The reset happened. 20 minutes later, the real director's account was being used to exfiltrate files. Where do you start the diagnostic? You do not start by asking, was the help desk technician negligent? Because that framing leads nowhere useful and destroys the psychological safety needed for anyone to ever report a similar incident again. You start by asking what identity verification procedure was supposed to be followed for privileged account resets, and whether it was actually followed. In the majority of real cases like this, the answer is that a procedure existed on paper, call back the employee on their known number, or require a manager's confirmation, but it was not actually followed because the caller's urgency created social pressure to skip the step, and because the procedure itself was not enforced by any system, only by trust that the technician would remember to do it every time under pressure. This is the critical finding. The control failed not because it was poorly designed in principle, but because it was optional in practice. The fix is not simply retrain the technician. The fix is to make the verification step structurally mandatory rather than discretionary. Build it into the ticketing system itself, so that a privileged password reset cannot be marked complete without a callback confirmation code being entered, removing the decision of whether to verify from the individual technician's judgment under pressure entirely. The second layer of this same investigation asks how the attacker knew enough real details to sound credible in the first place. This is where you trace backward into reconnaissance. Was the director's travel schedule, meeting calendar, or organizational role publicly visible through social media, a company About Us page, or a conference speaker bio? Attackers building a convincing phishing pretext almost always do their homework first, and the presence of specific, accurate personal details in the pretext is itself a clue about what information is leaking publicly that shouldn't be. The fix here operates at a different layer entirely, an OSINT review of what senior staff are inadvertently exposing, an awareness training specifically for executives and their assistants about the ways their public visibility creates targeting material for exactly this kind of attack. The third scenario, quieter and more chronic than a dramatic phishing call. Employees are found to be routinely using personal cloud storage, a personal Dropbox or Google Drive account, to move company documents around, in direct violation of the acceptable use policy that every employee acknowledged at onboarding. This looks, on the surface, like a simple compliance failure, something to fix with a stronger reminder email and perhaps a disciplinary notice. But treating it that way misses the actual root cause and guarantees the behavior returns in a different form. The correct diagnostic asks why people are choosing personal tools over official ones, and the honest answer, uncovered through actually talking to the employees involved rather than just pulling logs, is almost always friction. The official file sharing platform is slow, requires 3 approval clicks to share externally, or simply doesn't support a workflow the team needs, like collaborating with an external contractor who can't be granted a full corporate account easily. The employees are not maliciously exfiltrating data. They are taking the path of least resistance to get their actual job done, and in doing so, they have created a completely unmonitored, unencrypted, personally controlled surface that a social engineer targeting that employees' personal accounts could exploit to reach corporate data that never should have left the corporate environment. This is, functionally, a self-inflicted social engineering exposure. The organization made its own official channel unattractive enough that employees engineered themselves around its controls. The fix is not a sterner policy memo. It is fixing the friction in the official tool or providing an officially sanctioned, equally convenient alternative for the specific workflow driving the behavior, because you cannot punish your way out of a UX problem. The fourth scenario returns to something closer to the classic definition of a governance failure intersecting with social engineering. A risk was accepted 2 years ago by a manager who has since left the company, with no documentation of why, and it later surfaces during a post-incident review after an attacker exploited exactly that unaddressed gap. On the surface, this doesn't look like social engineering at all. But look closer at how these accepted and forgotten risks are frequently discovered by attackers in the first place, through reconnaissance that includes searching for outdated internal documentation, former employees' old presentations still indexed by search engines, or simply asking a current, unwitting employee, "Hasn't this always been configured this way?" during a pretext conversation designed to extract exactly that kind of institutional knowledge. Social engineers do not only target credentials, they target institutional memory and an organization with no discipline around documenting and revisiting risk acceptance decisions is an organization that has left its own memory exploitable. The job role lens, how different roles experience this threat. The same underlying principle, that humans are targeted precisely because they are trusting and helpful, looks entirely different depending on which seat you occupy when it becomes relevant to your day. The Security Awareness Manager experiences this trade-off at design time, long before any actual attack occurs. Their central challenge is building a training program that changes behavior rather than merely satisfying a compliance checkbox, and this is a genuinely difficult design problem because the two goals often pull in opposite directions. A compliance-focused program is easy to build: an annual slideshow, a quiz at the end, a completion certificate filed away for the auditors. A behavior-changing program requires ongoing, varied, realistic exposure, and it requires the political capital to insist that leadership treat the resulting metrics as a genuine organizational health indicator rather than a box-ticking exercise. When a department head refuses to participate in mandatory training, calling it irrelevant to their role, the awareness manager cannot simply escalate to discipline immediately, because that response confirms the department head's suspicion that the program is bureaucratic theater rather than genuine risk reduction. The more effective approach is tailoring, showing that department head a pretext specifically relevant to their function: a finance-adjacent phishing scenario for a finance leader, a vendor impersonation scenario for a procurement leader, because specificity converts generic corporate mandate into, "oh, that could actually happen to my team," which is the only framing that reliably overcomes senior-level resistance. The threat intelligence analyst experiences this principle at the pattern recognition layer, working weeks or months removed from any single incident. Their job is not to respond to one phishing email. It is to notice that a specific pretext structure, a specific sender infrastructure pattern, or a specific targeting logic, say, consistently targeting newly hired finance employees within their first 30 days, when they are least familiar with internal norms and most eager to be helpful, is recurring across multiple incidents or multiple organizations in a shared threat intelligence community, indicating a coordinated campaign rather than isolated opportunistic attempts. Building a campaign tracking system for this kind of coordinated social engineering activity means establishing baseline metrics for what normal phishing volume and variety looks like for the organization's sector, so that a genuine escalation, a sudden cluster of highly similar pretexts within a short window, stands out against that baseline rather than blending into routine noise. The analyst's version of the trade-off is depth versus timeliness, a thorough campaign analysis that correlates infrastructure, language patterns, and targeting logic across dozens of incidents takes real time to build properly, but a defensive team needs actionable warning before the 10th incident, not a polished retrospective report after the fact. The SOC analyst at L2 and L3 level experiences this trade-off at the sharpest, most time-pressured point of the entire chain, the moment an alert fires suggesting that a social engineering attempt may have already succeeded. Multiple failed SSH logins followed by a successful login from a foreign country IP address is a classic signal, and when the account owner says, credibly, that they were not traveling, the analyst is now investigating whether this is a harvested credential in active use. The specific skill here is what earlier material called human intent detection, looking past the raw technical indicators to reconstruct the story of what a human being, attacker, or legitimate user was actually trying to accomplish. Does the login pattern match how this specific user normally behaves, or does it show the slightly too methodical, slightly too fast navigation pattern of someone unfamiliar with the environment they've just gained access to, moving directly toward file shares rather than following the meandering pattern of someone doing routine daily work? The analyst runs parallel tracks under pressure exactly as described in the trade-off model generally. Soft containment first, blocking new connections and forcing session termination, while simultaneously pulling logs on what the account has actually done since that suspicious login and cross-referencing HR travel records and device fingerprints. The trade-off is always investigation depth against containment speed, and in a suspected social engineering compromise specifically, the analyst is also weighing a second, subtler cost. Acting too aggressively on a false alarm damages trust with the business and makes people less willing to report their own suspicious moments in the future, while acting too slowly on a real compromise gives a human attacker, who is actively making decisions and adapting in real time rather than executing a static automated script, precious extra minutes to move laterally or exfiltrate data. Case scenario: the 10-minute phone call. Let us close with a scenario built to bring every concept in this session together under a constraint that cannot simply be engineered away. You are the security awareness manager at a mid-sized financial services firm. 6 months ago, in the wake of several well-publicized help desk social engineering breaches at other companies in your industry, your organization invested seriously in this problem. Monthly phishing simulations with a graduated, non-punitive response plan, DMARC configured to reject on your primary domain, FIDO2 hardware keys issued to every employee with system access, and a callback verification policy for any privileged account action initiated by phone. On a Tuesday afternoon, the help desk receives a call. The caller identifies themselves as a director in the wealth management division, sounds genuinely frazzled, and says they are locked out of their account ahead of a call with a major client in 20 minutes, a call that, if missed, could cost the firm a significant piece of business they have been cultivating for months. They know the director's actual name, correctly state their actual department and manager's name, and reference a real, recently announced client relationship by name, information that had appeared in an internal newsletter 3 weeks earlier. This is not a crude attempt. This is a well-researched pretext, and it is applying textbook urgency and authority pressure simultaneously, with a business cost framing designed specifically to make the help desk technician feel that following the slow, proper procedure would itself be the costly mistake. Here is the constraint that cannot be engineered away: the callback verification policy that your organization built specifically for this scenario requires calling the director back on the phone number on file, which by design takes a few minutes, and the caller is insisting with escalating urgency that there is no time for that the client call is starting any second, and that the technician should just look at all the correct information they've already provided as proof enough. This is the moment the entire program is actually tested, not the moment the policy was written. The technician, trained through months of realistic simulation specifically on this pattern, recognizes the signature: high urgency, invocation of authority and business cost, and critically, active pressure to skip the specific verification step that exists precisely to counter this scenario. The training has built a specific low-friction habit: state, politely and without apology, that the callback is mandatory and takes only a couple of minutes, and that this exists to protect the director's own account, not to obstruct them. The technician initiates the callback to the number on file rather than any number the caller offers. The number on file does not answer immediately, because the real director is, at that moment, actually in a different, unrelated meeting with their phone silenced, a detail that in the moment feels almost like validation of the caller's urgency, adding pressure to just proceed anyway. This is exactly the point where a less disciplined process collapses because the callback failed to reach them, so let's just help them another way becomes an easy, sympathetic-sounding rationalization. The documented procedure, however, anticipated this exact failure mode. If the callback cannot immediately confirm identity, the request is escalated to a designated backup verifier, in this case the director's manager, rather than defaulting to fulfilling the request through an unverified channel. The manager is reached within a few minutes, confirms the real director is not locked out and did not make this call, and the fraudulent request is declined. The real director, reached later, confirms they never called and were never even aware of the attempted breach until told about it afterward. Now walk through what actually made this outcome possible, because a scenario without a genuinely difficult decision point is not a scenario worth studying, and this one had two. The first difficult decision was the technicians, under live pressure, to hold the line on a mandatory verification step while a caller was actively, articulately arguing that doing so would cost the business real money. This did not happen because the technician was simply a naturally suspicious person. It happened because the graduated non-punitive training program had specifically rehearsed this exact pressure pattern enough times that recognizing it and responding correctly had become close to automatic, rather than requiring the technician to reason from first principles while someone was actively working to prevent them from doing so. The second difficult decision was organizational and happened months earlier, at design time, building an escalation path for the specific failure mode where the primary verification channel doesn't respond immediately, rather than assuming the callback would always succeed on the first attempt and leaving the technician with no sanctioned option except to either wait indefinitely or give in. This is the compensating control that made the primary control actually robust under real-world conditions rather than merely robust in the tabletop version of the policy. The trade-off made explicit and worth documenting exactly the way a risk acceptance decision should be documented. This policy costs the organization real administrative time and occasional genuine business friction, including situations, unlike this one, where the caller genuinely was who they claimed to be and genuinely was in a hurry, and the callback delay genuinely did cost a few minutes of their day. That cost is accepted deliberately, in writing, reviewed periodically, because the alternative, a help desk optimized purely for speed and helpfulness, is a help desk that a well-researched pretext will eventually defeat, and the cost of that failure, as the MGM case demonstrated publicly, is measured in a completely different order of magnitude than a few minutes of inconvenience. Closing, what you carry forward. The next time someone asks you whether your organization is protected against social engineering, resist the instinct to answer with a list of tools. DMARC, FIDO2 keys, and a phishing simulation platform are not the answer to that question. They are three pieces of evidence toward an answer, and the actual answer is a judgment call about whether your organization has built verification into its workflows at the specific points where urgency, authority, and helpfulness are most likely to be weaponized against it, and whether that verification is structurally mandatory rather than optional under pressure. Social engineering will never be solved. It cannot be patched the way a software vulnerability is patched because it does not exploit a flaw in your systems. It exploits the fact that your people are decent, cooperative, and want to help each other and your customers, which is not a weakness you would ever actually want to eliminate even if you somehow could. The discipline is not to make people suspicious of everyone they interact with. It is to identify the small number of moments, a password reset, a wire transfer, a badge-secured door, where the cost of a brief, structured pause is trivial and the cost of skipping it is catastrophic, and to engineer those specific moments so thoroughly that following the correct procedure requires less effort than skipping it, even when someone on the other end of the line is doing everything in their power in real time to make skipping it feel like the only reasonable choice. That is the practice of defending against human hacking. It was never about building people who cannot be fooled. It was always about building processes so well placed at the moments that matter that even a genuinely convincing attempt runs out of road before it does any damage. End of session. Mental Model 37. Social Engineering, the Art of Human Hacking.